Phil Zito, episode 398. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 398 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking with my good friend Donny Walker of Newcomb and Boyd. So Donny and I met back when I still worked at Johnson Controls, was part of their analytics and system integration group, and even then, I knew that Donny was a unique individual. You see, I'd met a lot of consultants. I'd met a lot of commissioning agents. I'd met a lot of engineering firms. And I was like, this is interesting. I'm talking to a guy who gets it. He's not just about the spec. He's not just about only what the owner wants. He is about the system that delivers results. Now I say that and you're like, what the heck is Phil talking about? What does that mean? Well, having done a lot of business with a lot of different companies, I will tell you that there's people who are like, whatever the owner says goes, even if it's not in their best interest. And then there's people who are, whatever the spec says goes, even if it's not in the owner's best interest. It's very rare to find people who dive deep into the intelligent building stack. You hear a lot of people talk about the intelligent data layer. You hear people talk about all of this system integration. You hear a lot of talk about prop tech, but it feels very forced, right? I think James Dice, he did a post recently about a session he was doing and how some people walked out and they were saying how just they were feeling a certain way. And James does a really good job of explaining smart buildings and bringing all that technology together. But what I think was happening is that people feel like they can't relate to the person, and not saying this was James, but the person who's speaking on this topic. They're like, yeah, but how does this work for me, the facility person? How does this work for me, the operations person? How does this work for me, the business unit person? And Donny has a unique ability to kind of cross all of those thresholds. What we'll hear him talk about here, it's all over the place. And that's purely my fault as a podcast host, because I'm like so excited to talk to him. But we talk about commissioning. We talk about retro commissioning. We talk about implementing programs throughout facilities. How do you go and work this into a construction project? How do you work this into a retrofit project? How do you go and build a program internally to do commissioning, retro commissioning, continuous commissioning? This is a wealth of knowledge. This is like a master class in this topic. And my hope is that you all really like what I want you to focus in on here is what is the process? If you're listening to a Smart Buildings Academy podcast, it's going to hammer process. That's just how we think. That's how we teach. That's what we cover on podcasts. So I want you to focus in on the process. I want you to focus in on the application of the process. How can you apply it to your building or to your customer set? And then if you want to dive deeper, I highly encourage you to reach out to Donny. He is an awesome dude, really great at communicating, all around just great guy. And I encourage you to connect with him. You could do that at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/398. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/398. I know we're doing this on a Thursday, a little unusual. We had a holiday on Monday, so everything's kind of pushed a little bit, but definitely great podcast. I really encourage you all to listen. Let's dive in. All right. The man, the myth, the legend, Donny Walker. If you have been living under a rock, would be the only way you haven't heard of him. He's all over LinkedIn. Someone I've known for quite a while. I really like how he is able to take engineering concepts, especially the often ignored, continuing and retro and ongoing commissioning aspects, and put them in layman's terms and simplify them for the average person. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. It's going to be super awesome Donny, thanks for being here. Let's dive into the first question, which is a doozy.
All right.
How do you build a monitoring based commissioning program? And I'm going to ask you a lot of questions as you go through this because it's a doozy.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and I hope I live up to the hype. But
Always.
building a monitoring-based commissioning program is something that is very top of an agenda for us because it's something that we're currently doing, and it's an area that I think is often oversimplified. That if we monitor a building and have some analytics running on it, then we can achieve success. And we really come at it from more of a retro commissioning and continuous commissioning type approach of saying, it's great that the data can give us a lot of insights, and it can, but ultimately you've got to have someone that's really attuned to understanding what that data really means to be able to turn that into action. And so the question of how to build a monitoring-based commissioning program, I think, is to combine a really good data platform with analytics, with a team that understands building commissioning and retro commissioning, and what the do side of that is when you get that information. So, whether it's simple break fix type things that the data is really good at saying this was working yesterday, it's not working today, something broke here and someone needs to do something about that. But where I think monitoring based commissioning can really have a large benefit is when you take that retro commissioning approach to say, this is still working the way it was working when the building was turned over, but it could be working better. And that's our goal, is to have the investment mean that your building is improving rather than just not degrading.
So your firm, you do everything from the engineering side to the post-op engineering and support side. And what I want to focus in on here, so you said monitoring, but you also said retro, said turning data into action, having data platforms and having actions from those platforms. Let's start at the beginning. The project is tendered. The project goes to an architect. They select an owner's rep. All that fun stuff happens. They bring on an engineering firm. Maybe it's Newcomb, maybe it's not. How is that when we start thinking about monitoring based commissioning? I think it's when we should.
That's right.
How does that happen? Because I see it somewhat in ASHRAE 90.1. I was reading through that the other day, but then I see it get value engineered out a lot. So talk me through that story. Like, what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. From a design perspective, even though we're all in the business of smart buildings, we have stopped using the smart building terminology when we're talking about things that should be table stakes. And so we have really changed our terminology in design services to operational technology, because every modern project of any considerable size has the ability to be smart, and it's really just using the right means and methods to get you there. So you know what I mean? There's going to be network connected things. There's going to be some modern building automation system. You're going to have the ability of having the data that you need to do these things. But too many projects still are using really an old school, outdated methodology that makes it difficult to integrate and get that data into a modern platform and those kind of things. So we approach our projects and say, we're not going to have a conversation on whether you're trying to make this a smart building or not. We can get into those conversations later, but let's set up a secure OT network that gives us a place for things to live, so that we're not having shadow networks in the background that have to be figured out of how do we talk to them later, or someone saying that, we can't connect to that because someone put that network in and we can't be confident that it's secure, and all those kind of things. So let's get that going from the beginning to give us the capability to say, we can get access to this network. We can pull that data in and start to build the monitoring-based commissioning tools. But then there is, some of the design of things that you want to look at for, getting into the energy model, getting into what data points you need to be able to validate assumptions. And so, that can get into some of your design elements of making sure that you've got the data side of that. So, maybe a couple of extra sensors and meters to be able to do some validation that may not be critical from a sequence of operation standpoint. So that's kind of your lowest common denominator, is that I've got the right sensors that I need for my sequence of operations. There may be a little bit of additional data that you think about from a monitoring standpoint. But again, I think that should be table stakes.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree. I think SMART is an easy way to avoid being tied to an outcome that you can be held accountable to. Because you can be like, it's a smart building. And they're like, well, what does it do? So speaking of outcomes, do you all take a performance or a prescriptive approach to the spec writing and to the design of these pre-built systems?
So a performance approach from the area of how are we setting up the OPR and when do we know?
Which are owner project requirements, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And so we want measurable OPRs to be able to define success. But in the design of how to get there, then we get very prescriptive. And so, we're not trying to leave too much to the imagination, so that we're not able to really predict the outcome. So we get in and do more of the design of what's connected to the network, what type of hardware are you using here and there, and those kind of things that a lot of firms don't get into that level of design. They do more of a performance spec as it relates to building automation systems, and then just depend on the integrator or contractor that's selected to figure out the details of what it takes to get that performance. So we kind of have a mixture of both.
Yeah. So is this more of a collaborative effort with the system integrators? And to piggyback on that question, what level of collaboration do you get with the actual device manufacturers to make sure their stuff can actually do what they say it's going to do?
Sure. Yeah, we do quite a bit of collaboration with the manufacturers, and really lead with the manufacturers that have the capability of meeting those design objectives, but also some of their commissioning tools. And we really get a lot of that validation from the field, that we depend on the feedback from our commissioning team to say, I know vendor A, B, and C has said that they can do this, but what we've experienced is in the field, vendor B doesn't hold up the well as much as A and C do. So we definitely use that information and influences our design.
I circled commissioning tools. I want to come back to that later in the interview. Let's talk. Okay, so we've got our owner project requirements. How do you flush those out? Is it more of a use case mapping? Is it like a stakeholder collaboration? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's kind of two different sides of that. One would be your performance, that we're trying to achieve a high performance building. We are setting energy targets. We have designed systems and modeled them, and we want to be able to measure the outcomes of saying, are we actually getting there? And so that's one side of really understanding that performance. When we get more into use cases, it's more in the realm of smart buildings or smart operations, where we're saying that there are certain activities that we want to be available in the system and the platforms, and then that kind of dictates some of our specification or product selection and those kind of things. But that's less of the measurable and more of kind of the feature side of things.
Okay. Is this happening during like SDs, DDs, CDs? When does this all typically take place?
We prefer that it happens during SDs so that we can all be on the same page from the beginning of the design. Some projects, it may be difficult at that stage to get all the right people's attention, and so it happens later into projects. But have a lot of projects where we get pulled in as just the smart building consultant.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes as late as, the team is wrapping up CDs, can you come do a gap analysis of our design to help us get to where we're trying to get to? And so
Interesting.
sometimes that use case analysis is done at that late point, and then we're going back and saying, okay, you've got your design here. Can we make tweaks here and there? Can we, assist in product selection and specifying some of those features? Typically, it's getting a little more deeper into the network side of ththings to have the ability to get all that we need continuously, rather than systems that are a little bit hamstrung as it relates to trending because of the buses that they've selected and those kind of things.
Yeah. So you say a gap analysis during the CD phase if you're invited a little late to the party. What does that look like?
So that looks like doing a design review, taking the MEP drawings and specifications. Typically, we're overlaying a Division 25 specification where we're getting into the higher level systems, and then we're making sure that the electrical, mechanical, and plumbing properly has the links and connection points to Div 25. And then we're also looking at the componentry within those specifications to make sure that we've got clear alignment when it comes to a metering strategy or the architecture of the building automation system or the quality of sensors and those kind of things. And that's where we'll end up making some suggestions.
So if I hear you right, you're going into section 1 in Div 25, looking at related sections, making sure that's solid. You're going into section 2 materials, and you're making sure that that's solid, and you're making sure that there's not overlap. So we're providing a metering sensor in electrical, but we're also providing it in Div 23, and we're also providing it in Div 25. And then you got 3 electrical meters. I'm sure that never happens.
That's right. Or someone has the strategy of bringing all the metering into one platform, but because someone specifically said metering to the electrical design, now you've got an entire power monitoring system that the electrical team is providing. So now you're kind of integrating a really expensive system to this other system that's going to perform the same functions, and you're like, I really just need that meter. I don't need the expensive power monitoring platform.
Yeah, this isn't utilities.
Right.
Yep,
yeah,
that's pretty wild.
So I see that happen a lot, where and that's a big win for the for the overall process, because then you're saving more on what we're reducing than you are on the handful of things that we're adding. So it's going to be a net cost reduction rather than adding cost to the project.
Okay, so we got CDs. CDs are released. They start executing. What does it look like then?
So,
and I'll give you one lead, because I selfishly am very concerned about this, and I still get very conflicting answers. Everything's IP now, or trending that way.
Right.
But we're either not putting in an OT network, which you mentioned earlier, and relying on an IT network, which have things changed? Are they putting in IT networks before FF&E and certificate of occupancy now? Or are they still, because last time I did a project, IT groups were really protective of their switches, and they didn't want them in a building until certificate of occupancy because they were worried about things being damaged, stuff like that. So has that changed?
It has not. So let's talk ideal, and then kind of actual everyday run-of-the-mill project. So when we're able to manage a project from that early stage design, and we know that there's going to be a network convergence conversation. And in fact, we just got off of a call on a project that we're designing where we're having this exact conversation, because we do have an OT network, but it is integrated as a part of the overall enterprise network. So to be managed as an OT, but through software-defined access, there will be it's basically one network that's managed through different policies for OT and IT. So you do have the issue that you're describing of, well, I'm going to need building systems that need access to the network prior to, you're moving in furniture. You want to be able to do commissioning when commissioning is the right time to do it. What we have done successfully on many projects where we're tackling that issue is that we're working with the general contractor on scheduling, and we're basically saying, typically the IT rooms are at the core. It's something you're building out early anyway. We want to get those rooms finished, powered, cooled early in the schedule, so that it is now running its own unique chain of events in the schedule to get those rooms turned over, so that we can get active gear in a room and have that turned over earlier in the process, where you may still be doing tons of work out in the finished office space, and have that network online. At least have the OT network side of that up and running, so that you can use that for the active systems that are going in.
So that's the physical. I want to touch real quick on the logical side of things, because in my experience, GCs usually don't like to let people talk to the owner, but yet you need to talk to the owner in order to understand their IT addressing schema, how they want to manage ports, how they want to do port authentication. How do you coordinate that?
Sure. Well, that's where the benefit of the position that we play on a project is that we're talking to the owner and their IT team, many times before they've even selected a general contractor. So we're talking about these schemes of managing the project, and then the general contractor is a part of that team to help deliver that. So we're kind of the go-between of the solution team and the owner team to make sure that IT integration is happening.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a new set of skills. And that hit fast too. It was, 5 years ago, we weren't even having these conversations. And now you all need to understand subnetting and port forwarding and masking and NAT and all that craziness.
That's right.
How fun has that been?
Great. When you've
I like that. Great.
When you've got people with the right skill sets, and so it can be daunting for someone trying to
absolutely
to jump in and do this, that has great expertise in building automation systems but doesn't have that depth of bench of networking.
Yeah.
And that really brings on that role for the master systems integrator, that whether someone is coming in and providing a software application that's running on top of everything or not, someone has to be assigned to the project of taking ownership of that OT network. Whether it's coordinating with the security integrator for getting all the cameras IP'd all the way down to the metering and everything else. You need one entity that takes on that project responsibility on the implementation side, where we're taking that ownership on the design side.
So we've talked about design, we've talked about implementation. Now let's talk about owner engagement. Okay, so we come up to percent completion 80, percent completion 90, and it's as-built and owner training. What does this look like then? What is monitoring-based commissioning? How does that translate to an engaged owner?
Sure. I think part of the recipe for success there is making sure that your commissioning team, which on some of the projects that we've done, that's been another third-party commissioning agent that was on the project, where we were more the Division 25 consultant and the Division 25 commissioning agents. In other words, we're commissioning the platform where they're commissioning the mechanical systems. And on some, we're like end to end, we're doing mechanical systems commissioning and the full technology stack commissioning. But in either regard, the person doing the commissioning and writing the functional test needs to include that level of integrated system connectivity and make sure that those functional tests are, not just testing componentry, which is what we see a lot, but testing, complete functional
tests. Yeah,
that's right. And then that owner side of it is getting the operations team involved in that. We don't always see that. Sometimes we're building a building and someone's telling us we don't even know who's going to operate the building yet. It might be outsourced. or we've got this team in this other building, they're really sharp, I don't know if we're bringing them over here or not. So there's not always that ideal world where you go, let's bring in the team that's going to operate the building and get them trained on it. But that is the best case scenario, is when you can truly bring in the operations team, have them go through and see what those functional tests look like, have them see you interpret the data on the data side to what that means physically of things that need to happen. And then you're basically training them to be able to do that in the future. And that's always our goal, is to have an owner operator that is able to use the tools, doesn't have to spend a lot in third party reliance of people continuously giving them additional services that they're having to pay more for, because it starts to drain down the ROI that they've spent the money on the tools. Now they're having to continuously spend money on more professional services to be able to properly operate them. So we like to perform more of the train the trainer model. So let's be heavily engaged during the warranty phase, help kind of get things dialed in, and then train that team in that first year. This is what you need to do. Call us when you're stuck, kind of thing, versus we're going to always be in your space, and ultimately spending operational dollars to do so.
So we just painted the picture of taking this from design idea to trained owner who's operating it. Let's go, and with that picture painted, let's take more of a macro approach, and let's talk about how do we even pre-qual an opportunity, because there's a cost of sales, right? Both whether it's your firm doing it, whether it's a system integrator coming in wanting to bring a monitoring based commissioning solution to their customer. What are the telltale signs that, okay, this is a viable sales pursuit opportunity, or why are you spending time on this? It makes no sense. What's the difference?
Sure. Yeah. So we've had opportunities that we have been brought into, where someone wants to go and look and potentially take this kind of approach, where our initial assessment was this building is not ready for this conversation. We'll be glad to help you, but what we need to help you with is getting this building to a point that it can even be properly maintained. So those are typically your 20-year-old buildings that still have a lot of pneumatics, that has the team that used to operate that has retired out, so they've got a team that wish they had something digital, that doesn't really know how to work with what they have, and the building is just in an ongoing state of neglect. And so those are the ones that you go, I'd love to do monitoring based commissioning here. And, typically someone has a high level meter, maybe their chiller plant is on a digital system. There's some things that you can start to help them with, but really what that turns into very quickly is an upgrade strategy of how do you start to really gain control of this building. And it's more of an engineering exercise than it is a commissioning or monitoring exercise. So those are the ones that we say, great that you have that goal. Let's put you on a 10-year plan to get there. But it's going to take money and perseverance to get there. But short of that, with modern buildings, there's not really a lot of them that you would say is not an opportunity. Especially for anything that is owner operator. If someone has a third party operations contract, that can be a bit of a conversation around a go no go, because if they are tied into a long term operations contract and that team has zero interest in doing anything besides fundamental break fix, and it is not going to, no matter how easily you tee up the information of getting to improvement, is not going to do it, then why spend the money to gather a bunch of data about everything that could be done, knowing that you're never going to do anything with it? So we do have the conversation going in of what success looks like, and what the operations team needs to, they don't have to all be there today, that's where we get back into the training side, that we can help your team get there, but they have to at least be willing.
Yeah. So I'm interested in all the regulatory pressure that's coming down the pipe, Inflation Reduction Act and all of its tax incentives and tax deductions. How is that influencing the viability of some of these legacy buildings that are non-DDC pneumatics and would require a pretty big shift in order to monitor them?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think what that is now doing is taking us to a point to where we're able to change the conversation to a decarbonization strategy. And so we're not just saying, let's do these things because of X amount of years of payback of energy improvements or operational efficiencies, but now we're looking at it and saying, you need a true plan of benchmarking where you are today, so that that's kind of one of the things that we'll come in and do and say, let's figure out where you are versus where this building could be, and then design a decarbonization strategy to do energy improvement, to do operations, to start looking at, do you have the opportunity for solar on site for energy offsets and those kind of things, and really building out that long-term strategy towards decarbonization.
Let's also talk about the one kind of, I don't want to say elephant in a room, because it's not an elephant in a room, really. It's just a misunderstood opportunity by a lot of folks, and that's utility incentives and rebates.
Sure.
How does that factor in to preparing a building for a monitoring-based commissioning approach?
Yeah, that can be a big factor. We were just talking with someone last week about some really high-end lab projects in the Northeast, and looking at a kind of a smart lab opportunity to really have operational improvements that can change that OPR to be able to run the entire lab in a more efficient manner. And it was the utility rebates that kicked it over the edge to something that was in the 2-year payback versus just the energy savings. And so areas that have really good utility rebate programs, it can be kind of equivalent to the energy saving side. So basically taking a 4-year payback and turning it into a 2-year payback by adding that utility rebate into the equation. So definitely something that we're going to look at. It's very regional, and so really the areas that already have the most energy incentive in the Northeast and the West Coast are the ones that have the better utility rebate programs as well. So that's why I think we all see so much going on in those two areas, because you've got the high energy and the utility rebates to work with. Whereas here, where we are in the Southeast, you've got less rebates and cheaper energy. So, it really takes more, willpower and, really looking more at the sustainability metrics to push things over the edge versus, a pure energy ROI.
So speaking of that, so Southeast, lower Midwest, et cetera, places which have lower utility costs, less utility incentives. What factor are you seeing workforce play in this? And I'm going to preface this question to kind of just give it some, guardrails on it. The customers we talk to on the owner side, a lot of their workforce is aging out. They're leaving the workforce. They haven't retained tacit knowledge, so their contingency and continuity plans are somewhat non-existent. How does monitoring-based commissioning augment workforce? Because you get two, in my experience, you get two schools of thought. You get monitoring-based commissioning done right requires a educated workforce who can actually take action on the information provided by the system. On the other hand, you get another school of thought, which is we can have a less educated workforce or less experienced. It's not really education, it's more experience. Less experienced workforce who because they're getting the information, they can utilize outsourced contractors more easily to resolve issues. So how does that play into things?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer is it's kind of both, but there's a lot of opportunity there on the data side to right size that workforce. So, in other words, we are definitely not believers that technology is replacing an educated operator. There's no system smart enough to be able to self-diagnose and send something down to a low-level technician to say this is what you need to do, and you don't have someone that really understands fundamental building management and control managing that process. And so that's something that we always want to stress is that if you've got a great building engineer, they do not need to be threatened by the technology. They need to be empowered by the technology that's going to make their job easier. But there is that ability of having that job be simplified to the point that if you're building out a regional portfolio, you don't have to find those guys that don't exist. There's not enough of them. You don't have to try to find that person to sit them in every building. You can have a more regional approach to say someone's responsible for these 5 buildings, someone's responsible for my portfolio in this city, or those kind of things, and then have them be able to work with the technology to really validate those actions of what needs to happen and have that go to the technicians. And at that point, yes, the technicians can be less skilled. They're not having to do the diagnosis. They're just doing the action part. That can be either in-house or outsourced. But if you're going to outsource it, you need to have someone insourced to make sure that they are doing what is needed. Because when we see things get completely outsourced, to the point that there's no one within the organization, the owner's organization, that's in that loop, then that's when we start to get the things not happening, because basically it's no one is managing the process and making sure that the important things are getting done, even if they're hard and expensive.
Because I could also see this done right, properly, tying into capital planning strategies.
Sure.
Asset lifecycle maintenance. So, we're looking at the system. It is slated for a 30-year life cycle, but trajectory shows based on the monitoring that it is degrading. And we need to now properly capital plan for maybe a 27-year life cycle.
Sure, absolutely. We see that all the time. We see that with control systems, that someone has put a 30-year life on something.
Oh my God.
And said,
it's so bad our industry does that. It's like no one, I mean, not no one, but like most other technologies don't do this, but it's like a badge of honor. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox on that.
How long you can make that 1980s technology work?
Oh my gosh, it's so bad. Green screen, Barber Coleman. I mean, I did Chicago Public Schools, and the Barber Coleman system. Oh, it was painful back in like 2008. Whew. Anyways, I could save that trauma for a therapist. So,
but the flip side of that is we've seen well-maintained air handlers that have been scheduled for replacement at a certain year, and we come in and look at them and go, no, let's do a little bit of maintenance on it and keep it rolling and save that money for something over here that's deteriorating.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, inlet vanes properly maintained can actually work. So it's interesting. So, all right, we've talked about pre-qualing. I think the audience has a pretty good idea. It's a combination of looking at the age of the building, incentives, the system maintenance. I mean, even if you have a DDC system, it may be poorly maintained, to your point. But now, what makes a project successful, and what, more importantly, makes a project not successful?
Sure. I think what makes a project successful is what I was mentioning earlier, of getting into the details of optimization, and then seeing those through. So that's where you can really start to um, tweak some of your sequences, because you now see how the building is being operated, how it's reacting, and start to influence some smarter sequences, and then having the ability to get that done. I think where you're not going to see success is when you're purely monitoring. People aren't willing to make modifications and make it work better, and so you're just you're hamstrung by what you can do. And so that the willingness to do those things is kind of the indicator of when that's going to be a success. But some of that can be a pretty big effort. So we are currently doing a project that we were not the design engineer on. The intent was never quite realized. So it was really complicated sequences, kind of to the point of a science project versus a building project. And the monitoring based commissioning can help prove out where things are not successful, but it's a pretty large effort to get it there. And so that requires, in some cases, real dollars to modify some things, physically, not just sequences. But when you get into that point, it's great that the technology has helped you identify this, but that you're now getting to a point to where it's that capital asset life cycle that you were talking about, and when that life cycle is a couple of years after the building was built, and you're wanting to do these things, people aren't going to be too happy about that, no matter how good the technology performed or how good you help them identify the problem. So those are the areas that obviously we all have to go in knowing is that not everything that you find is an easy, quick fix. Of course, we wished it was, but once you get to that point, it's a hard conversation no matter what.
I'll tell you, one of the things I like about you, Donny, is that you can say a project was a turd without saying it was a turd. You said it so nicely. You're like, well, there was, an opportunity. Yeah, they designed a turd, but it's all good. I'll say it so you can continue to be nice.
There you go.
All right. But one of the things, let's do a little thought experiment here on optimization to try to help the audience visualize this. So you got an air handler with 30 VAV boxes, mixed air unit, hydronic cooling, hydronic heating, demand control, ventilation, all that jazz.
Yep.
Monitoring based commissioning goes in. It's got the default, the ASHRAE 62, ASHRAE 90, ASHRAE 55, all the common variables plugged into it for sizing and for set points and test and balance and all that fun stuff. You throw monitoring based commissioning on. What is monitoring based commissioning looking for, and how would it modify the sequence and or set points? Like, what would that look like in practice?
Yeah. Typically what we're looking for is some of the outliers. And so if you've got a system well designed for optimization, you are really using the outputs data from your VAVs to be able to drive what your air handler is doing, being able to maintain the right output from the air handler and maintain static throughout the system, and everything's satisfied, nothing's over pressurized, so it's that level. So we're looking at all of that information to make sure that that's happening. But sometimes there are zones that, for some reason or another, how that space is being used, or how certain things are sized, that need to be taken out of that equation. And so what we're typically looking at is making sure that the system is set up with proper voting, so that voting is what is determining what's happening back at the air handler, and that something that is consistently driving it in the wrong direction because of a poor performing zone is taken out of that
Interesting.
And that may require some modification to that zone so that we can bring it back into the fold after that's fixed, or maybe you just determine that that zone is going to be a problem zone, but we're not going to let it drive all the way up the scale this air handler to do more than it needs to do, which in essence makes the chiller plant do more than it needs to do. So
Yeah.
the endpoints matter, and we see a lot of people talk about chiller plant optimization, and they're strictly operating at the plant and not getting down to the endpoints. The endpoints are what drives everything all the way up
Absolutely.
in a properly optimized system. And so we look at it and say, let's go in the reverse. Let's go endpoint management, driving it back through the air handler, balance and optimize the hydronic system back to the plant, and through that process we see drastic improvements at the plant, without going through and doing just kind of the high level plant optimization efforts.
Yeah, I want to highlight that because that's a really smart point, because the building is a system. And if you ignore the endpoints, the terminal units, the fan coils, the air handlers, etc., the chillers, like without those systems, the chiller's never going to have a call to cool. It's going to have no call to cool. So like if you're trying to optimize a plant, which I mean, I get it. It's important. There's a lot of kilowatt hours in a plant's use across pumps and compressors and all that.
That's right.
But you can reduce that demand through optimization. It sounds like on the air side, you're talking about guideline 36 trim and response. And then you're saying that the monitoring base may show you that you have a starving zone, or maybe there's a delta between set point and zone temperature. And you're saying, man, this is horribly inefficient. Let's maybe go get physical eyes on. Oh, it's full of computers. It was designed to be a waiting area, but they actually made it a server room. So no wonder it's not able to keep up with the load.
And that's the reason that what I was saying is that successful monitoring based commissioning is the technology plus the people, because just getting that information is not going to give you what you just said. You're going to have someone lay eyes on that, and that's the role that we play, being kind of that go between for the operations. Because the operations team may not feel comfortable going back to ownership and saying, we got a zone that was improperly designed here. That's not something that they're typically going to be comfortable doing, or feel like they're asked to do. Whereas that is what we're going to do. We're going to work with the operator, as their liaison, and say, we think that this is an issue that needs to be resolved here. Bring it back to the ownership team and say, if we do that, this system is going to start performing better. Let's address that problem, and it's an actual bigger picture thing, because it's affecting total building optimization versus just one zone that's not performing well. Well, I got a lot of other problems too, so I'm not too concerned about it. Taking that part of the big picture and bringing that back to say, it's important. Let's get it done. That's a real smart operation strategy to be able to take things holistically end to end.
Which ties perfectly into our next question, which is tying monitoring-based commissioning into business processes. So at the end of the day, you've said it multiple times during this episode, which is it has to be tied to a process. But how do you even identify business processes? Because that's more feels like an owner service kind of level person engaging consultatively. It does not seem necessarily like your typical construction process. So how do you sit down with these folks and be like, all right, walk us through, how do you have a call center? Do you have a dispatch? Is it just a rotating on duty? Like, how do you work this out?
Yeah, so that is operational consulting. It's at that point, it's no longer design and construction, our typical, we're turning over a project, we're commissioning it to make sure it works, and we're moving on. That's getting into the operational consulting. What is the team that you have here? What tools do they have? How are you managing asset life cycle? What's your CMMS platform? How are you issuing work orders? who do they go to? What's your alarm plan? How do you manage alarm escalations? Like all of that is what I consider the capabilities that typical construction projects provide. So as a design engineer, you're not paid to sit down with the operations team and figure all those things out. It's just the standard fee for a standard project does not include time for their mechanical design engineer to sit down and spend a week with the operations team and talk about those type of things. But someone needs to do it. A building automation system that's capable of doing all kinds of great things goes underutilized when no one ever ties the operations team back to that system's capabilities and then tweaks those capabilities to meet the needs of the operations team. So it's a whole nother level of operations management and consulting that needs to happen. And that can happen with any building. That can be a building that you've been in for 5 years, to we're turning over new construction. Let's sit down with a team that's going to operate it and talk about how all this works.
Interesting. So let's talk about that actually. So we processed out the MBCX and let's process out what that operational consulting looks like. So come across a customer, either someone you've worked with or someone who just somehow comes across you, or maybe your sales team finds them. Like, how do you begin to dig into facility business processes and to understand maybe this is an opportunity for retro commissioning, maybe this is an opportunity for monitoring based commissioning? What is the methodology to first engage the right stakeholders and then identify the processes and then build the tech stack to either augment or support those processes? I know that's a big question.
Sure. Yeah. No. We start that with stakeholder interviews, and so it depends on who you're starting with, on what it takes to identify those proper stakeholders. But we ask those questions of who's responsible for this, who's responsible for that, who's managing the building, who's managing the plant, and really go through and sit down and spend time with them individually, not as a group setting where people aren't comfortable giving you the real answers of what's going on. Sit down, at their front end with them and ask them about, alarms that you're seeing and things that they do for management, looking at their tools that they are using, and being able to, quickly assess, is that really best of breed, or is that just kind of something that, has been a long-term tool that they've used that they just kind of inherited and, either don't know how to use, or it's not capable of doing modern things. Do they have an asset management system that goes into their operational considerations? So, there's a bit of a discovery phase there with the stakeholder interviews and assessments, and that's not like a detailed multi-week assessment. This is a day or two that you can really start to get that picture of how a building or campus or what have you is operated, and then that's where the consulting comes in, is that you can take that back, come up with some plans of where you see the most opportunity, and then sit down with the right stakeholder and say, here's what a path forward looks like, and then kind of spend some time putting a master plan together after that to get them from where they are today to where they could be.
Okay, so we've sat down with the stakeholders. I assume by vertical market, you start to identify common use cases, like healthcare has these, higher ed has this, K through 12 has this. So you identify those, you get stakeholder engagement. They say yes. At this point, you've got to start to discover their tech stack. You've got to start to build out, what is their infrastructure? What systems do they have in place? What are the tech gaps? What does that methodology look like?
Yeah, so we have the kind of the list of tools. We call them mapping systems to use cases, and so certain use cases, there's these different things in the technology state that it gets there, that it takes to get there, and then part of that assessment is figuring out which ones of those they have and what do they need. And that's why I mentioned a master plan, because typically at this level that we're engaging with someone of doing this, we're putting a master plan together, because you may not have the ability to go directly to everything that you need, but it should at least be on the roadmap of your master plan, so that they understand, one, what the end game looks like, because you don't want to be like, well, let's do this and then let's do this, and then they feel like, oh, we're just doing all these things that I'm never done. What does done look like? So that kind of goes into the master plan. But then you can assess, where you may have an outdated CMMS that's not capable of integration to some of these things. And you may suggest, as a part of this effort, let's look at a new system here that's going to be able to integrate to our analytics engine. Is going to be able to integrate to the BAS. You're going to be able to automate workflows to really paint the picture of how technology can help automate part of the process, to make it easier on the individuals. So that master plan is going to go from use case kind of to ultimate system, mapping and selection. And then that's where the gap analysis comes in to say, where are we at today? What is it going to take to get there? And then paint a picture for them of what a 5 or 10-year plan might look like, depending on how big the engagement is and what the capital restraints are.
And then you put it together, I assume, in work packages with your vendor ecosystem, and you have them bid the work packages, and you provide this, you have them give you budgetary numbers for the work packages, and then that creates the capital plan budget. And then you say, okay, well, we need this technology before we can have this technology. So you have That's right. core layer, and then you have the silos you can build upon those core layers.
That's right. Yeah, we call those foundational systems that, the OT network is a part of that. You may not be replacing your entire network, but we at least want to gain a cyber secure manner of getting access to things. And so, sometimes there's a cybersecurity side of that, of saying, let's get the right technology in place of what is managing your ins and outs of your network. And so that OT piece is foundational. Obviously, a building automation system is foundational. You've got to have something that's giving you all your inputs and outputs and managing that. And then, those other kind of technology stack things on top of that may be, more tied to your use cases.
Interesting. And so how do you address the data side of things? Because you can't buy a data, right? You can't touch a data. And for those of you who think I'm speaking improperly, data is the plural of data. That's why I'm saying it. I get so many emails that are like, hey, folks. And they're like, you said folks. So, all right. Data is plural of data. That's okay. So you can't purchase a data. You can't touch a data. You can't buy a data, like I said. So how do you address the data schema? How do you budget for data mapping, data normalization, data shaping, data structuring? That was always the biggest challenge back when I was doing a lot of SI work. What's y'all's approach to that?
Well, when we're talking about that master plan and looking at that technology stack, a lot of times the automation that's involved in, the analytics and fault detection and, mapping things over to your work order management system and all those types of things, it requires, a true data layer to be able to get there. And so we build that into the process to say, it's not going to be good enough just to get all this data from endpoints ingested into your building automation system. You've got to do something with it. And that's what creates the opportunity for the data layer, which then gets into data ontologies and system mapping and what are you doing with the data. So every opportunity that we get involved in with, at this kind of level, we have some platform that is our data layer that is ingesting all of this and really enabling these advanced use cases and capabilities to happen. So that definitely, there is a cost for that. So that goes into the overall cost model to get us to a point to where we're able to do the things that we're talking about. And, obviously we're looking for right sizing that and not spending a lot of money bringing useless data into the data, because a lot of times people will just say, how many points do you have? And I saw my system by points. And so you've got 20,000 points for this campus or building, and you've got, our software is X amount. And so then all of a sudden this thing looks like, a more expensive cost than what they can manage, where we really need to go into that and say, let's evaluate what we're trying to manage, what data do we need to do that, and then bring that data set into the software so that we're, not doing spending a lot of money on things that
Yeah.
really don't influence management or control.
I mean, selfishly, that's where I have really high hopes for Haystack because of them systemizing the data structures so that we're not doing a per square foot or per system. Well, we are technically doing per system with Haystack, but we're avoiding per point or per square foot because that's where I saw a lot of analytics fall apart in the early or in the late 2000s, like 2010, 2009, is everyone was pricing per point. And they're like, oh, well, 100,000 square foot building, they must need 50,000 points. And it was absorbent.
Right.
You couldn't make it work.
That's right. Yep. And getting to that point, it takes a little time to diagnose. And so, that's the reason that you've got the rule of thumbs out there, is because a lot of times people aren't willing to pay for the assessment that it takes to give you a real number. So, if you call someone that's selling software and tell them, give me a price, I've got a 100,000 square foot building, and that's all you're willing to give them, they got to have some kind of way to estimate what that might be. They're not going to turn down the opportunity to quote something because they're in the business of selling software. And so, it's kind of owner education to say, you got to give them more than that to get a real price.
So I was actually having a conversation with a firm a couple weeks ago, and one of the suggestions I made to them, I went to their website and they sold analytics, and I said, you have this, to your point, how many square foot, I'm not going to call out which company this is. They say, how many square foot is your building? And I'm like, it would not be a stretch for you to put how many square feet, how many floors, how many systems, and just with that little bit of information, and like, what vertical are you? Are you healthcare? Are you commercial, et cetera? Just with adding that form and a couple drop down boxes, they would get so much better qualified leads coming into their system. They would know exactly what they're walking into. But people don't ask these questions. It's mind boggling.
We ask for, give me your maintainable asset list. And so now I've got a number of air handlers, VAVs, chillers, everything. And if they don't have that,
exactly,
we're back to operational consulting. You need to know that.
If they're like, our plans are in a closet somewhere and haven't been updated in 20 years, then that gives you a very good picture of what you're walking into.
That's right.
Interesting. So I know we're at an hour now, but I'm going to ask you the two questions I've started asking our guests. So one is, what excites you right now in the building space?
Yeah, what excites me right now is the level of adoption in the things that we're doing. Where I felt like in the early days we had to create the need in order to fulfill it. So you were kind of having to really educate on why you would even be interested in talking about this, and then kind of painting the picture of what the end state looks like. Where now we still do a lot of that, but the industry adoption rate has gotten to the point to where we're brought into some really cool projects where people have teed it up. They know exactly what we do and what needs to be done. They're just soliciting for someone to fulfill that. And so I see so much of that from my own small view, I can see that the industry is growing exponentially because of how much demand there is, and really starting to be incorporated as the normal process. So people building $200 million projects and above, they are thinking about this. There's still plenty of smaller projects where no one's thinking about the data management and technology stack and all of that. But the large buildings or campuses or districts, there's so much construction going on right now. They're thinking about it, and the opportunities that are out there are very exciting.
So I got one more question for you. It's a doozy. So are you ready? Here we go. It's a confusing question, but it's a good one. So if there was a question that I should have asked you but didn't ask you, what would that question have been?
Oh, well, I guess we didn't spend a lot of time talking about data from a data integrity and user experience and how that ties in. So a lot of the time that we spent today was talking about operations, which is great because we were on the topic of monitoring-based commissioning, which is really getting into operations. But what we're seeing equally as much as we get into the operational side of things are that user experience and how does the occupant interface with the building? How does that tie into building optimization and overall just creating a better experience? And so, there's a lot of interconnected discussions when we get into occupant experience and building operations and bringing all of that together. So not that you should have asked that, but that would be a larger topic for another time.
Yeah.
But that's another area that we spend a lot of time talking.
All of this push to return to office.
That's right.
And then I can literally go on my phone here and mess with the lights. I can go and change temperature. I got a remote humidifier. Why would I want to go into something that looks like a 1970s horror flick and be, yay, I'm in the cube again with people talking so loud that I can't get anything done because I have ADHD and I can't focus now. Awesome. So,
that's right. That's something that we're talking about, as our own firm of getting people back into the office. And so, we're looking at a renovation along with everybody else in the world because
get rid of open office spaces. Do it.
What you're trying to do is create an environment in the office that exceeds the capabilities of the home. Whereas, before no one was thinking about that. You weren't thinking about all the comforts of home back at the office. But once you've had multiple years of working out of your home, there's certain things you've gotten used to, and you're not ready to go back to the big open box and that has no amenities for you.
I'm serious, man. Like sodas and I have a lunch every day. It's great. And data integrity. It's funny you hit on that because I talked with Devin Tracy of Lockheed. I've yet to interview Sabine Lamb with Google, but I'm going to, and both of them hit on data integrity, data cleanliness, and just how difficult it is across an enterprise environment. So yeah, very topical.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was fun. So thank you so much for being here. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed this podcast with Donny. I hope you took as much from it as I did. He's a great guy, really a wealth of knowledge. He's forgotten more about commissioning and continuous commissioning than I've ever learned. So great guy, great source of information. Definitely go to podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/398. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/398. And you can connect with him and learn more about maybe how he can help you if you're an owner, or maybe you could just get some information. He's really big on pouring into other people and sharing what he's learned. All our guests are. We've had some fantastic guests, and I really encourage you to reach out to him. Thanks so much for being here, folks, and I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day. Take care.